Okay, so in this video we're going to talk about the breakdown of my thought process in creating this terrain and another similar project where I changed the parameters of what I needed to do with this. So starting this off, we'll come up with a couple different ways of creating craters. There is an example scene that you could of course go based off of, and there's lots of ways in which we can create the whole crater idea, just as we can create a similar idea for like a volcano or something like that. So if we look at the circular gradient, right, this is just taking gradient, setting it to radial, and then of course you can adjust the scale as you need to. It's a a circular form, and the impact craters are often somewhat circular. The primary thing that you have to do is you have to look at the ingredients that you need in order to create the object. So when I look at a crater, I see it's round, I see it's indented, I see there's a ridge. So these are all things that I'm thinking about in order to try and create that initial base shape. So utilizing the additional primitives, I'm trying to create what you might consider like a complex primitive, something that is based off various primitives together, which actually many of these things are. So I start with the gradient, and I look at the indentation that's supposed to be there, and I'm thinking about this here as inside out, so sort of like inverted in the way that I'm going to eventually use this. So looking at this, it's going to this peak and then back down, which is not exactly what I need. So I need to do something to make this sort of bulge out a little bit more, make it more of a bowl shape rather than a peak shape. One of the ways that I can accomplish that is making use of a tool like gamma. So taking the gamma all the way up here, I still have a peak, but you notice it's not sloped in that indentation. It's a little bit rounder. Now also in this process, it's gained a little extra height that I didn't really need, and I want a shallow indentation, so using bias gain, going ahead and dropping that bias. And when you drop the bias, you often have to drop the intensity as well, because intensity will lift this base form. So as I drop the bias, this area will start to lift up, and I want that back down at 0. So that's the intensity. Intensity will drop all the information down, whereas the bias will kind of squish it. So it's kind of like bias works sort of like a scale, and then the intensity brings it up or down. And then I have this constant here, which I'm going to carve out of. So taking the constant gives me a height to the ground that I do want to keep. And then I can subtract that. So I go into this here, subtract, and then I determine by how much. And that's giving me that indentation. Now there's some artifacting here that I'm not really appreciating, so I do want to soften that a little bit. And this at the base. So by applying a little bit of a blur, softens that and allows me to continue moving forward from there without weird pixelated edges or whatnot. So it's a very small blur. It normally starts off at a power of 2. That was way too much. What I wanted was something reasonable, so I just kept on bringing it down until it looked like there was enough of a visible edge there, but it was also quite soft. Repulse is the next one I added to this, and the reason for the repulse, kind of look between them, is if you take it down to this lower region here, it pushes outwards, right? It's going to push outwards on it. I still have that little bit of a bump there, but again, this is a primitive that I'm going to process through things like displacement, landform, erosion, those sort of things. That really subtle malformation is not the end of the world. It's not something that's going to be of huge impact to me, so I'm not too worried about that. Really what I'm worried about is the curvature of this, and so the repulse has given me what I need there. So I'm most of the way there. I've got this shape, but I do need to problem solve my next issue. And my next issue is that I need this raised edge. When the meteor or whatever impacted the earth, it hit the ground and it pushed the dirt outwards, right? It threw it out. And so right around the edge, that was kind of shoved upwards in this motion, then came back down, and it created this rim. Some of the other stuff would have, flying out a debris and, gone all over the place, but the main thing was that ridge. So what I did was I split off using the portal, so going ahead and splitting off here, just so that I could focus on the rest of this chain here. And I thought, well, maybe there's a way that I can select primarily this edge. Just kind of grab this edge and maybe I can expand it and blur it and I'll get some kind of ridge from that. So I tried it. I went ahead through curvature and I played with the max and min and fall off, and I managed to get something pretty close to grabbing just that rim. Then of course I needed to expand it before I could do much with it, so I went to aperture. And aperture will take height value information and you can use it to expand or contract. And so I just used the defaults here. Really didn't do much to it. And you can see the disk artifacting here in little circles, but it's not all that bad. So I go to auto level. Auto level, of course, is going to push that value up, keeping the black at black and bring the other values up to like a maximum. So if it's only starting at dark gray, it's going to lift that dark gray all the way up until eventually it reaches towards white. So you have areas in here that are white, others that are gray. It's not everything's been blasted, but it's kind of there. I could of course play with things like gamma or equalize to adjust that, but as is not that bad. So plugging that into a constant as a mask gives me this. And so we have this weird kind of chunky thing going around, and it's neat. It's almost like a castle wall, and if that's what I wanted to do, then who knows, maybe that's a way to accomplish something like that. It's definitely interesting, but it's not what I need. So I want to chop off all the stuff around the outside here. And the way that I can do that is going to the clamp tool. Clamp has an option called clip. And what clip does, of course, is it goes ahead and it says anything above a certain value, chop it off. And anything below a certain value, chop it off. So I went in there and I did that. I went and used aperture again to expand it even further. In this case, because it is just all flat, I didn't get that same kind of artifacting that I got from the curvature, which was variable, right? It wasn't a proper perfect circle. And then applying a blur to that gives me a mount that I can start to work with. Using aperture again, I've used it in the opposite direction to create a sharper ridge. So I still have this thick mount, but that ridge is sharpened just a little bit, not too much. So now that I have that, I'm just going to go ahead and add it to this. One note that I didn't pay attention to while I was building this is that in my clamp, my clip minimum could have been set lower. I think it's still sitting at the defaults, which has raised this a little bit. I didn't need it to be raised. So I could adjust that, but it's fine. So the difference is just a little bit increase in height. It's not a big deal. So I've set this to screen so that it adds values on top, but it's not adding two necessarily. Add would probably push it way further than I needed it to, whereas the screen is just giving me that nice little pop to the ridge that I wanted. So now that I have my primitive of sorts, I want to start adding more detail. Before going to things like erosion or that kind of stuff, you want to add detail to it first. This will give something for erosion to work with, to create more interesting shapes. So I went to a Perlin and played a little bit with its settings just in terms of scale and the method of noise. So little kind of, lumps here and there. And I added that in a very low ratio. That's just going to give me variation to the shape in terms of height, so variable height in there, and then all throughout this space as well. By using landform will now go ahead and push things in angular directions and then add a little bit of its own erosion to it. So you can see the erosion curves are in there. I dropped the displacement so it wasn't as extreme as it was initially, but that's giving me a lot of angular detail. So this is just height information, but it's still soft and pillowy. Now it's starting to look like actual ground because of pushing in those side to side and forward and back directions. So of course the next thing to do with this is just to make it even a little bit more natural and going with an erosion. So the erosion, I think I may have dropped its duration a little bit. It may have been a bit too strong to begin with. I'm not entirely certain. And I think that's about it in this particular case. Does that give me a nice solid starting point for this? Now there's other things that I added to it, but they became part of the texturing process, and so we'll save those for afterwards. Let's look at another process that I use in order to create the shape to begin with. So again, starting with this gradient, and once again going with the gamma and bias gain to get that starting point. However, in this particular case, I made use of repulse. I used repulse twice in two different variants to give me a little bit of a variance between them. So one that's inwards a little bit, and one that's outwards just a little bit more. I could have used something like transform as well. Transform could have been used to scale. The only disadvantage that transform offers you is that the edges around here would break down. So let's say let's grab transform in this particular case, and I took this to scale downwards. In this case it's already flat, so actually I could have used transform here, so that might actually be a better way of handling it. But if it was inverted, let's show you that. If I did it with an inverted version of this, and you can see the problem, right? It's cut into that edge. So as long as the base around it, everything around it is flat already, no problem, but as soon as you run at that, you have an issue. And there's this mirror edge thing, which my understanding was that it was meant to mirror whatever is here on the opposite side, so either it's not currently working or I just misinterpreted what it was supposed to do. But that comes into part of the problem solving process, right? You want to make sure to think your way through these issues. So I had the one repulse and the second repulse a little bit larger, and then in the combine, what I decided to do was screen them. And if you look at this, what it's producing is it's lifting this ridge here, and it's creating this indentation, which when I invert, you can see that I've got this ridge. So it's just another way of solving the same problem. If I go to my aperture, I use that to extend that ridge a little bit, and I could probably do it even more than that. I found an issue later on when I get to erosion that caused me a little bit of grief, but I'll explain that when we get there. So I'm then doing a general sort of height assessment here. and then doing a bias gain. And what I did this for was to give me more height to this ridge. So it's just kind of grabbing this chunk here and bringing it down. I could have done this with a regular bowl, and it would have given me a similar kind of result without the ridge. So not necessarily the best overall idea I had, but it produced something interesting, so I went with it. It gave me this interesting kind of up and then down and then back up again. So I'm working with it. Went to blur, and I got this. Now that ridge is not as sort of broad as the previous one that I had, but it's at least as tall. Making use of repulse. And in this particular case, what I wanted to do was an angular impact. I wanted to show the idea of it coming down and hitting into this region. So I'm using repulse in a slightly different way here. I'm actually going in and adjusting the scale of it and adjusting its X and Y position to get it over here. So that what happens is I'm actually pushing outwards in a small area this region. By doing this, I get a slightly more oblong shape. So then go ahead and then using repulse again, I push it even further. Well, that's great. I have this big bowl and it's got, you know, the X and Y direction in interesting shape there, but I need an angular collision, right? It hit here and then it slid into place. So I need something in that region, and I've got this little mound here which is going to be a little bit of a problem later if I don't deal with it as well. So I figured, why not hit two birds with one stone, and see what I could do with the gradient. See if I could insert a gradient of a specific height and just blend it in. So I created a gradient. I flipped it the opposite way around because that's the direction I needed. I needed to go down and slope that way. I made use of bias gain to adjust its height. And then in combine, setting that to max means that it'll only keep the max height. So I made sure that that back edge was just short enough that it stayed under here, but that it added to this region and create that initial slope. Now I want to create that sweeping motion where, you know, it kind of blowing in from this side and then out the other. And something that's really good for creating like a directional sort of movement to the surface, it's great for doing sand dunes and whatnot because that's what they do, is recurve. So recurve gives me that sort of melting bit to this region here and builds up this ridge there. So I get this sensation here. So now that I've got this primitive for my angled impact, I'm going to go ahead and go through that same other process. So in this case I'm going to use displace, and I'll add a displace to it. And displace sometimes instead of landform will give you some bigger shapes along with the smaller ones, so there's a little bit more variety there. And there's no erosion that comes from it, but that's fine. Purlin, of course, to give some more height information. Combining that again in a small degree. So coming from here, you can get a little bit of height variation. Then, of course, going to landform eventually. And this gave me some interesting sort of streaks in this direction, which was sort of neat. And then I went ahead to go ahead and do my erosion. Now this is where a problem has occurred, because when I hit the erosion, it completely melted my slides. Now in the other case, I had a nice big sweeping arc that, you know, came, and there was a big ridge, and then it went back down in, and so the erosion sort of respected that gradual gradient. It didn't really beat down on that. But here I've got a rather shallow jump from this ridge here just into downwards, and so the erosion is of course going to eat away at that. It's an opportunity for that all to sort of collapse and fall away, and this may be fairly close to accurate in terms of how it would respond. So I went in and I painted a mask, just going based off of that information. So anywhere it got too close to a ridge that I wanted to keep, I just went ahead and painted it away so that I could keep that erosion there. Now, of course, I don't want a sharp edge to transition, otherwise, often case you'll see them just kind of plop down. So you always want to apply a little bit of a blur to that mask so that you get a softer transition between the eroded and non-eroded regions. So I'm taking that erosion and adding it to this landform via that mask. Now, this is good, but I don't have that higher ridge that I want, and I want to get that ridge in there, because again, it hit here and that stuff should have built up a ridge. So I go here to the gradient tool. In this case, I'm going to use sine, which is another way of creating this sort of shape, this additional ridge. I could have used this, and in the crater example, this is what's used. Do a little bias gain to it. And then plug that in as a mask to an angular gradient. So this is going to give me this angle to that. And again, this is based on my initial direction. So I'm going to apply some repulse. Again, for obvious reasons. It's going to sharpen that ridge, and it's also going to expand. So I'm going to take this and add it to it with a little bit of breaker to get some additional details down in there, just some additional cracks. And for it to work out well, I had to adjust things like the river length. I made it longer so that I get these kind of flowing down further and into here a little bit further, just because I felt this was getting a little bit bald in this middle section. But also adjusting things like the depth and sometimes the erosion power, just to prevent it from digging too deep. So of course, hand painting that mask for the area that I want to lift up, blurring it so that I don't get a really sharp transition, and then adding it in. So you can see that ridge. And then erosion to bring it all back together again. So that's my angular impact. Now, some things that I realized would be good for this, it would be nice if I had a way to scale it in only one direction. So I put a request into the suggestions for having the ability to scale in one direction rather than both directions for the transform. And yeah, that would give me something to work with in order to create the shape a little bit easier. That way I could have a longer area of impact, and I could play with things like repulse to pinch one region and another. So moving on here, and back to our other little friend. So when it came to coloring this, I had the Behringer crater in mind. I looked at the Barringer crater as sort of my source of inspiration overall in terms of what this looked like. So of course, using rock slide, I went ahead and made use of some of the erosion detail here to create a mask, which you're not seeing very well. There we go, now you can see it, auto level. So the soft sort of mask area to allow rocks to appear. And so these are a subtle addition. They're maybe a little bit more visible at a higher resolution. You can kind of see them there. And so I figured, you know, wherever the erosion thought that piles of dirt would collect, that's where the rocks would appear. And so I went through the deposits, and then I used that to sort of control that. I also combined it with the wear, because that's where also some breakage would be happening. So I thought that some exposed rocks from those regions might be visible. Further along, doing a difference between those rocks so that you can see the piles more directly. Hopefully this is visible in the video. I'm just getting really close. So just the rocks. So the difference between the erosion and the rock slide allows me to expose those. To make them even more obvious, of course, auto level. So auto level will take those and make them really strong. And I run those through a clutter node to brighten them up. And so that way I can expose those rocks specifically as color information. Going through curvature allowed me to isolate a lot of the little details in the surface. And with that, I went to sat maps and used that to give me some color variation. So I just kind of picked way through and found stuff that was along the lines of sort of a dirt color, and gave me some of the variations that I want. In mixing these together, the black has darkened it. I've just used a blend, and it's added a little bit more contrast to some of those lower rocks in those regions. And that's all I really needed to do with that. So actually, something else that I could do here is I could have switched this to screen instead, which would have made them just brighten the stones as opposed to darken everything else, but I didn't mind the way that looked. Coming back with this here, passing that through the clutter node, I use this to create some variation in color. I went a little bit brighter and darker in both, and a little bit more saturated than I normally would have, because my intent was to blend them again. So if you're not taking something and you're using say these other modes, right, add, screen, etc., but you're actually just going to use blend. If you use blend, you always have to go a little bit more powerful or potent than you originally intended, because the end result is you only get, you know, half of that information. So this right here, between these ones, it's, you know, the contrast is fairly stark, and the intensity change between them is relatively strong, just as the saturation for this and the intensity change for that is rather strong. When they come back together, it ends up becoming more subtle because it's only half of that. So I get, you know, small subtle details in terms of the color variation across there, and then the sweeping forms in here are nice and smooth. So taking the height information off of this, I went and manually created some color ranges just to control, you know, area of green, a little bit of gray, really brightening that ridge, which is something that I saw in there, and then kind of working with this midsection to make all this ground go there, and it's not necessarily 100% accurate to what I expected for this mid region, but it's something. There's other ways in which I could have created, say, like custom shapes, maybe used another gradient or something, or use a different point along the line with regards to the original shapes to help me create this gradient more specific to what I wanted. I could also, hand paint a mask to control certain colors in certain regions. So there's lots of options that I had. I was roughly satisfied with what it gave me. This is basically just a sketch anyways, knowing that I could always go back into something like Substance Painter and actually detail paint this if I really wanted to. So sometimes it's just about exploring the ideas and then seeing if they're going to work and what the disadvantages or advantages of them are. So that's all these sketches are for me. And these things that I advise to you to go ahead and try out. Just explore an idea, see what happens. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, and you just switch to like the lower resolution, occasionally popping up to a higher resolution, without the express expectation of creating something permanent, something that you're going to use. Don't like get married to the idea. Just explore the tools and see what happens. So I've got that, and when I mix them together, again with a blend, again I get that subtle change. So some of these things that came from this are going into this. So you see some of those subtle sweeping forms. There's a little bit of variation in there, and if I wanted to intensify that, I could always take something like this and run it through, say, like a color effects. Oops. Color effects. And I could do something like an auto level to have really intense values here, and then plug that back through, and now you can see those bits are much stronger than they were before. And I actually like that better. I don't know why I didn't think of that in the first place. That's part of the exploring process, right? Adding that intensity back in because I intended to blend it. The other thing is, you notice my green is really, really green, and that's because I knew I was adding sort of beiges to it, which would mute it out and give me that that almost like dark celery green that you get from mosses and other things. So sometimes you look at it and you look at the color variation that's there, and you say, okay, I need to go a bit more saturated, I need to go a bit darker, a bit lighter, and just look at it how it blends. So I went back and adjusted those colors after I saw how they blended with this. Okay, in looking at the reference, there's other details in here. I also tried some experiments. It's not necessarily the way that I would work this, but I went ahead and I did a quick snow, and that's all just to get the snow mask. And then I went ahead and blurred that snow mask. I also went ahead and did a slope. And so the snow mask was applied like this. Give some variation. And this to push in the greenery, more of that greenery in there. Mixing that together to get that kind of breakup. I also wanted to add the variation in there, so the variation comes from this purlin, which I manually created this variation of color, and I masked that off with a height so that it just happened in that region. So it's going from this to this, then to this to add those little darker regions, and then the greenery, and of course last but not least this flow sat maps. Just gave me a whole other range of other details in there. And again, some of these things they end up being experiments and others are not. It's just a combination of different features. This one we didn't discuss. So I played with height information based off of Voronoi. I wanted to get different breakup, and by combining them with my actual shape, just by setting it to min, so all the lower regions, that would basically make them fall away. So I had the shape, and then taking the Voronoi and just kind of eating away with it with a min. Then using height information, as well as another copy of height information. So this is the same height node. I just copied and pasted it, but one coming from the original shape and one coming from this shape. And then through the combine, I did a multiply, and what that did is anywhere there were black regions, they would cancel out any of the white that was there. So rather than having all this additional stuff out here, I got rid of it, and it just left me those broken up chunks, which then I blurred a little bit, and I used them to add some of this orange banding that I saw in the Behringer crater. And so that was just added in enough that you could see it, and again with that consideration that it would slowly disappear as I added more and more layers over top of it. You see it starts to fade out until we get here, and it's just kind of a subtle effect. So hopefully this breakdown is giving you a little bit of insight into how I approach some of my problem solving and some of the ideas that I applied in order to create these two different terrains. I wouldn't suggest necessarily following this as a step-by-step tutorial to make this specific thing, but rather the different ways in which I use some of the nodes to solve some of my problems, and see if you can come up with a crater in a different way. Maybe you can skip a few steps that I didn't need to make. Maybe you can come up with a better way of approaching it. There's so many ways in which you can do these things, like getting a radial gradient. So I have two gradients here. And I will invert one of them. We'll go ahead and connect them. And I should actually set them to radial because I haven't. And we'll do a min. One of these has not turned into a radial gradient yet. There we go. And you can see what happened there, is that it's kind of cut into that ridge, right? The only thing that is a little bit off here is that the height of this is not quite correct. So there's a few ways that I could deal with this. I could go and auto level both of them, or I could bring this one down. Which one should I do? Let's just copy, paste, and look at the differences. I'm going to do a bias gain on this one. And the bias gain, as I bring the intensity, it's going to bring the whole thing down. So let's just press F to focus on this one. That way I can play with this guy's settings. And as I bring the intensity down, I'm dropping that other thing that's carving into it, making my hole in this a little bit deeper, right? Intersecting them. Alternatively, I could go ahead and just auto level them. So there's one auto level, there's two auto levels, and they haven't built yet because I'm still pinned by this one, so I'm just going to take this, press F to turn off that pin, combine 1, 2, so it's got the same settings, and again we get the same kind of idea. It's carving into it, it's just the whole thing's taller. So if I was happy with the height, fine, otherwise I have this, in which case I'm still going to have to do a bias gain on this, or something else in order to drop its height. I could always try and take the influence down, but that's changing the influence of the node as it affects the primary one, so this first one. So if I play with that influence on this one, it takes away the effect of what it's doing with the other one by subtraction, so it leaves it back to the normal one. And that can be useful if I wanted to change the depth of how far it's carving into it. But other than that, there's no real use for it. So there you have it. A whole bunch of ideas. Go explore. See you in the next video.